On a freezing Boston night, a 7-year-old girl ran after a millionaire's car just to return $2 he'd been overpaid. He thought it was a small act of honesty, until weeks later she stood beside him in court, fighting to save the only home her late mother had ever protected. Snowmelt shivered across the black pavement of Halcyon Row, turning the street into a ribbon of broken reflections. Boston was deep in one of those bitter winter evenings that made even the rich hurry and the poor disappear early. A sleek obsidian SUV slid to the curb outside a narrow corner market whose buzzing neon sign had already lost 2 letters. Out stepped Callan Thorne, 37, a billionaire, whose name was etched across towers, transit contracts, and technology panels from Boston to Seattle. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a midnight blue suit, the kind of man who looked built for glass boardrooms and hard decisions, not for places where the heater rattled louder than the radio. Inside, the market smelled faintly of old coffee cardboard and snow-damp coats. Callan was on his phone speaking in clipped, controlled tones about permits, acquisition timelines, and an upcoming redevelopment vote. He grabbed bottled water, black coffee, and painkillers, barely looking up as the cashier rang him out. Near the register stood a tiny girl in an oversized mustard-colored coat with frayed cuffs. She was so still she almost blended into the shelves, except for her eyes, clear, watchful, impossibly bright. Callan paid in haste, tucked his receipt away, and stepped back into the brutal cold. The SUV door had barely shut when a small voice pierced the wind. "Sir, wait." The driver braked instinctively. Callan turned. The little girl was running toward the car, her worn boots slipping against the wet pavement. Her pale cheeks were flushed from the cold strands of dark, honey-brown hair stuck to her forehead, and in her tiny clenched hand were 2 wrinkled dollar bills. Breathless, she reached the lowered window and held them out with trembling fingers. "You got too much back," she whispered. For a second, the city seemed to stop moving, and without knowing why, Callan Thorne looked at those $2 as if they weighed far more than money ever should. Callan stared at the child beneath the amber street lamp, the winter wind tugging at the edges of her coat, as if the night itself were trying to pull her backward. She could not have been more than 7. Her boots were old, the soles worn thin at the edges, and the scarf around her neck looked hand-mended in 3 different places. Yet there was nothing broken in the way she stood. Cold, yes. Fragile, maybe. But not broken. He lowered the window the rest of the way and glanced at the money in her hand. "You ran after a car for $2. The girl nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "It was yours." Most people would have smiled awkwardly, kept the cash, and called it luck. Some would have justified it. Some would have needed it. But this little girl had chosen freezing air, a dangerous chase, and the risk of being ignored just to return a mistake no one would have blamed her for keeping. Callan took the bills slowly, almost carefully, as though he understood he was receiving more than money back. "Why didn't you keep it?" he asked. The girl lowered her eyes for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "My mom said money feels different when it's honest." Something in the sentence struck him with strange force. It was simple, old-fashioned, unpolished. And because of that, it felt truer than almost anything he had heard all week in rooms full of powerful people. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ilawan," she said. Then, with the smallest pause, "But my mom called me Winnie." Winnie. The name seemed too warm for the cold around them. Then she glanced anxiously back toward the market and took a step away. "I have to go." Callan frowned. Go where she looked toward the store door again, and her answer changed the temperature of the night. "My little brother's inside." Callan stepped out of the SUV before he had fully decided to. The cold hit him hard, but not as hard as the image forming in his mind, a 7-year-old girl chasing cars in the dark, while her younger brother waited alone inside a corner market. He followed Winnie through the glass door, the bell above it giving a tired metallic jingle. Near the old space heater at the back of the store, A little boy was curled up on a wooden chair, asleep in a way only exhausted children sleep, deeply, awkwardly, defenselessly. He looked about 4. A threadbare gray scarf was wrapped around his neck, slipping crookedly over one shoulder, and one tiny shoe had come half undone. His lashes rested against pale cheeks, still flushed from the cold. In his lap sat a stuffed fox with one button eye. Winnie moved to him instantly. She didn't shake him awake. She didn't fuss. She simply adjusted the scarf, fixed the loose shoe, and pulled the sleeve of her own coat over his small hand to keep it warm. Then she tucked the stuffed fox more securely against his chest. Like she had done this so many times, it lived in her body now, automatic as breathing. The cashier, a tired older man wiping down the counter, looked up and sighed softly. "They come in sometimes when it gets too cold outside," he said in a low voice. Girl always watches the boy, never causes trouble. Callan crouched beside Winnie, lowering himself until they were almost eye level. "Where are your parents?" For the first time, the little girl went still. Not dramatic, not tearful, just still the way a room goes still after a light goes out. "Our mom's gone," she said quietly, "and there's nobody else who stays." The heater rattled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, traffic hissed through wet snow, and for the first time in a very long while, Callan Thorne felt completely helpless in the face of something money could not instantly fix. For a long moment, Callan remained crouched beside the little boy sleeping by the heater, listening to the thin hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the windows with a low, restless howl. The world beyond the glass was sharp and unforgiving, and suddenly the idea of 2 small children stepping back into it alone felt unbearable. Callan straightened slowly and looked at Winnie. "Where do you live?" She hesitated. Her eyes studied him carefully, the way children do when they have learned too early that trust must be earned. Finally she answered, pointing down the street. "Halcyon House. Just around the corner." The cashier glanced up from the counter. "Old brick place," he muttered. "Elevator hasn't worked in years." Callan looked at the boy again, Micah Winnie had said, and then back at the little girl whose shoulders carried far more responsibility than they should have. "Let me drive you," he said gently. Winnie's first instinct was to shake her head. Pride flickered across her face, quiet but stubborn. Yet the wind outside rattled the door, and Micah shifted in his sleep, curling deeper into the thin scarf around his neck. She looked down at him, then back at Callan. "Okay." Minutes later, the SUV moved slowly through the narrow street. Winnie sat beside her sleeping brother in the back seat, one arm around him protectively. The warmth of the car fogged the windows, softening the city lights into blurry halos. When the car finally stopped, Callan saw Halcyon House for the first time. An aging brick building stood between 2 gleaming new developments, its paint peeling, its front light flickering weakly above the door. To developers, it probably looked like a problem waiting to be erased. But when Winnie opened the door and carried Micah inside, she looked at the building the way someone looks at the last place that still remembers them. Apartment 3B was small enough that Callan could see almost everything from the doorway. One narrow bed pushed against the wall, a tiny folding table, a hot plate sitting on top of a crate that served as a kitchen counter. The air smelled faintly of canned soup and laundry soap that had been stretched too thin. Yet the room was clean, carefully clean. Winnie laid Micah gently on the bed and pulled a worn blanket over him. The boy stirred for a second, but didn't wake. She tucked the blanket around his shoulders with quiet precision, smoothing the edge the way a parent might. Callan watched without speaking. Then Winnie crossed the room and opened a cabinet. Inside were 3 cans of soup, a small box of crackers, and 2 chipped bowls. She poured water into a dented pot and set it on the hot plate, standing on her toes to reach the knob. "You cook?" Callan asked quietly. Winnie shrugged. just easy things. Steam began to rise from the pot as she stirred slowly, glancing back now and then to check that Micah was still sleeping. Every movement was gentle, practiced, responsible. Callan noticed something then. On the small table lay a folded piece of paper, its edges worn soft from being opened and closed many times. Winnie followed his gaze and quickly placed her hand over it. "That's my mom's note," she said. Her voice softened when she spoke about it. "She left it for me," Callan nodded, not asking more. Some things deserved to be offered, not taken. A moment later, Winnie set 2 bowls on the table. She broke crackers into one of them and stirred carefully. For Micah, she explained. Callan felt a strange pressure in his chest, because the girl standing in front of him wasn't just a child trying to survive. She was a child trying to keep someone else safe. Later that night, when the soup had cooled and Micah had eaten half asleep before curling back under the blanket, the little apartment grew quiet. The wind tapped gently against the window. Callan stood near the door, preparing to leave, unsure how long he had already stayed. His schedule for the next day was packed with meetings, investors, and a city council hearing about redevelopment plans. Yet somehow, none of that felt as immediate as the fragile stillness in this small room. Winnie noticed him glancing again at the folded note on the table. After a moment of hesitation, she picked it up and handed it to him. "You can read it," she said softly. The paper was thin and worn. The handwriting was uneven but careful. Callan read, "If I'm late, be brave. If I'm gone, be kind. Protect Micah. Return what isn't yours. Home is where love stays." For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he folded the note exactly the way it had been before and handed it back. "Your mom sounds like a remarkable woman." Winnie nodded, pressing the paper gently to her chest before placing it back on the table. "She said people can lose a lot of things," the girl murmured. "But if they keep doing the right thing, they won't lose themselves." Callan looked around the little apartment again, the careful order, the thin supplies, the sleeping boy. Something shifted quietly inside him. He had built companies, won battles, and moved billions of dollars across cities. But standing there, he realized something unexpected. The smallest promise he could make in that moment might become the most important one of his life. Callan Thorne did not sleep much that night. From the glass walls of his penthouse overlooking the frozen Charles River, Boston glittered in disciplined rows of light. Towers he had helped finance stood like quiet monuments to success. Contracts, investors, expansion plans, his life had always moved forward with relentless precision. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image. A 7-year-old girl running through winter wind just to return $2. Honest money matters. The sentence refused to leave him. Just after sunrise, before his assistant even finished arranging the morning meetings, Callan made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He canceled the first half of his day. Then he returned to Halcyon House. When Winnie opened the apartment door, she looked startled to see him again. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and radiator heat, and somewhere down the corridor a pipe knocked rhythmically. Callan held up a paper bag. "Breakfast," he said. Inside were warm pastries, fruit milk, and a small pair of winter gloves clearly meant for Micah. Winnie accepted the bag slowly, but when Callan stepped inside, she looked at the groceries on the table and then back at him with quiet seriousness. "We don't want charity," she said. There was no anger in her voice, only dignity. Callan paused. Then he asked gently, "What do you want?" Winnie thought for a moment. Her answer was simple. "We just want to stay here." Callan followed her gaze toward the small room, the narrow bed, the cracked window frame, the careful order of everything she owned. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And something about the way she said it made him realize this story had already become bigger than kindness. Now it was about keeping a promise a child had never stopped believing in. Later that afternoon, Callan stood across the street from Halcyon House and studied the building more carefully. In daylight, the contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side of the block stood a newly finished glass condominium tower, its polished balconies reflecting winter sunlight. On the other side, construction crews were already pouring concrete for another luxury development. Between them stood Halcyon House, old red brick faded window frames, and a sagging metal fire escape that creaked whenever the wind shifted. To most developers, it looked like the final missing piece of an expensive puzzle. Callan already knew how the system worked. Old buildings in valuable neighborhoods didn't survive long once investors started circling. Paperwork followed, inspections appeared, property managers changed. Eventually, the tenants left one way or another. Still, something about this building bothered him. He walked into the lobby. The floor tiles were cracked but scrubbed clean. The mailboxes were dented but labeled neatly in careful handwriting. A small bulletin board displayed community notices, childcare swaps, grocery assistance, handwritten reminders about heater repairs. People lived here, people who had tried very hard to keep dignity alive inside worn walls. As Callan stepped back outside a black sedan pulled up beside the curb, a tall man in a camel-colored overcoat stepped out surrounded by two assistants carrying folders. Callan recognized him instantly. Dorian Voss, one of the most aggressive real estate developers on the East Coast. Dorian glanced briefly at Halcyon House, then at the surrounding construction sites. His expression cool and calculating. He didn't see a home, he saw an opportunity. And as Callan watched him walk toward the building with quiet confidence, a troubling realization began to form. Halcyon House wasn't just an old apartment building. It was the last obstacle standing in the middle of a very expensive plan. The notice appeared 3 days later. It was taped neatly beside the mailboxes in the lobby of Halcyon House, printed on official letterhead, and filled with long paragraphs of legal language most of the residents barely understood. But one sentence was painfully clear. Notice of property redevelopment and tenant vacation requirements. Within hours, the hallway filled with worried voices. Tenants stood around the paper reading it again and again, hoping the words might somehow change if they looked long enough. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others began whispering about moving, though no one seemed to know where they would go. When Winnie returned from the corner store with Micah's medicine, she stopped in front of the notice and studied it carefully. She read slowly, moving her finger under each line the way her mother had taught her. Then she folded the paper down again. Callan arrived a few minutes later and saw her standing there alone. "Do you understand it?" he asked gently. Winnie nodded a little. "They're saying everyone has to leave." Micah tugged at her sleeve, confused by the tension in the hallway. Winnie knelt beside him and smoothed his hair before standing again. Then she looked up at Callan. Not frightened, just serious. "Will my brother lose his home?" The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, Callan had no answer ready, because suddenly this wasn't just about contracts or buildings. It was about a child trying to protect the only place her little brother remembered as safe. And Callan Thorne realized something with quiet certainty. Someone had decided Halcyon House was just property, but he was about to make sure they understood it was something else entirely. 3 days after the eviction notice appeared, the air around Halcyon House felt heavier. Tenants whispered in hallways. Doors closed more carefully than usual. Even the old radiators seemed quieter, as though the building itself understood something was changing. That morning, a sleek black sedan stopped outside the entrance. The man who stepped out wore a camel-colored cashmere coat and polished leather shoes that had never touched a sidewalk like this before. His hair was perfectly silver at the temples, his posture confident, almost leisurely. Dorian Voss. In Boston's real estate world, the name carried weight. Entire neighborhoods had transformed after he set his sights on them. Luxury towers, waterfront hotels, multi-million-dollar penthouses. Opportunity followed him. So did displacement. Dorian stepped into the lobby of Halcyon House as if he already owned it. Two assistants followed closely behind, carrying folders and tablets. He barely looked at the tenants watching from the stairwell. To him, the cracked tile floor was not history. It was inefficiency. The aging elevator sign wasn't character. It was delay. Callan arrived moments later. When the two men faced each other in the dim lobby, the contrast was immediate. Both powerful, both controlled. But their intentions moved in opposite directions. Dorian smiled politely. "Callan Thorne," he said. "Didn't expect to see you in a building like this." Callan's voice remained calm. "And I didn't expect you to start pushing eviction notices this quickly." Dorian glanced around the hallway. "This block is about to become one of the most valuable development corridors in the city," he said casually. "Progress tends to move faster than nostalgia." "Nostalgia," Callan repeated quietly. Dorian gestured toward the stairwell where several tenants had gathered nervously. "These buildings had their time," he said. "But cities evolve." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Callan said something that shifted the tone entirely. "People live here." Dorian tilted his head slightly, as if considering the idea. "Yes," he said. "For now." Then he adjusted his coat and walked toward the exit. Before stepping outside, he paused beside Callan. "This will all be resolved properly," Dorian added smoothly. The word properly lingered long after he left. From the stairwell above, Winnie had watched the entire exchange. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. And the way she held Micah's hand told Callan exactly what she was thinking. The man who wanted their home had just arrived. That night, Callan sat in the glass conference room of Thorne Infrastructure's headquarters, staring at documents spread across the table. Across from him sat Soren Pike. At 46, Soren had built a reputation as one of the sharpest legal strategists in the country. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word had already survived a courtroom. "The eviction notice is technically legal," Soren said, "but the speed of it is suspicious." Callan leaned back slightly. Meaning someone wants the building cleared before anyone has time to challenge it. Soren slid a folder across the table. "Halcyon House has changed ownership 3 times in 20 years. Shell companies, layered transfers, very deliberate." Callan studied the documents. Then something unusual caught his eye. "Go back," he said. Soren flipped to an earlier page. At the bottom of the document was a faded signature. Callan stared at it. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on contracts when he was a boy, on letters his father used to leave on his desk. Alaric Thorne, Callan's father. For a long moment, the room fell silent. "Your father funded the original redevelopment project here," Soren said carefully. "Not the kind he was famous for. This one was smaller. Community housing." Callan looked back down at the paper. "I didn't know about this. Most people don't." Soren pulled another document from the folder. "There's more." The page contained a clause buried in the original property covenant. It was only 2 sentences long, but it changed everything. Soren read it aloud. "No resident family of Halcyon House shall be forcibly displaced from the property without equal relocation housing provided under community protection agreements." Callan slowly sat forward. "Meaning?" he asked. Soren met his eyes. "Meaning if that clause is still legally binding?" He tapped the paper. "Dorian Voss may have just started a fight he can't win." The next evening, Callan returned to apartment 3B. The hallway outside smelled faintly of soup and radiator heat. Somewhere down the corridor, an old television played softly behind a closed door. When Winnie opened the door, Micah was sitting at the table coloring on the back of an old grocery receipt. Callan smiled slightly. "I need to ask you something," he said. Winnie nodded. Callan stepped inside and glanced at the small room again, the careful order, the neat stacks of folded clothes, the worn but clean blankets. Then his eyes landed on the folded note on the table. May I see that again? He asked gently. Winnie picked it up and handed it to him. The paper had softened even more since the last time he read it. The handwriting was careful but uneven. If I'm late, be brave. If I'm gone, be kind. Protect Micah. Return what isn't yours. Home is where love stays. Callan turned the paper over. At the bottom corner, written very faintly, was a name. Maris Vale. Callan froze. Slowly he looked up at Winnie. That was your mother's name, Winnie nodded. Callan felt the room tilt slightly as pieces began connecting in his mind. He remembered something Soren had said earlier that day. A community coordinator who had worked in Halcyon House during its early years. A woman who helped residents organize food childcare and tenant protection meetings. Her name had been mentioned only briefly in the documents, but Callan remembered it clearly now. Maris Vale. Winnie's mother hadn't just lived here. She had helped build the community that protected the building, which meant something extraordinary. The little girl who had chased his car to return $2 was standing inside a home her mother had once helped save for others. And now history had circled back. Callan folded the note carefully and handed it back to Winnie. Then he looked around the small apartment again. This fight wasn't just about real estate anymore. It was about a promise someone had made long ago, and whether the world still honored it. The more Callan Thorne searched, the clearer the past began to speak. 2 days after discovering the covenant clause tied to Halcyon House, Soren Pike returned with a thicker stack of documents. They spread across the conference table like pieces of a forgotten map, community development records, tenant meeting minutes, archived foundation reports from more than 20 years ago. And one name appeared again and again. Maris Vale. Callan leaned forward, slowly scanning the faded pages. She wasn't just a tenant, Soren explained. She helped run the support programs when the building was first protected under your father's housing initiative. Callan frowned slightly. My father never mentioned this project. Because it wasn't part of his main developments, Soren replied. It was smaller, almost experimental. He funded the building through a community trust, something designed to keep vulnerable families from being pushed out of the neighborhood. Soren slid another document across the table. This is where Maris Vale shows up. The paper was an old meeting report from the Halcyon Community Housing Initiative. Volunteer coordinator Maris Vale responsibilities listed underneath included food support networks, childcare rotation, tenant mediation, and housing rights education. Callan sat back in his chair. So Winnie's mother helped protect the building. Yes, Soren said quietly. Which makes what's happening now ironic. Callan stared at the file for a long moment. He imagined Maris Vale walking those same hallways decades earlier, organizing meetings at the folding tables in the lobby, convincing residents that their homes mattered. And now her daughter lived in the same building on the edge of losing everything that woman had fought to preserve. That night, Callan visited Halcyon House again. In the lobby, he met an elderly tenant named Inez Bellamy, who had lived there for nearly 30 years. When he mentioned Maris Vale, the woman's face softened instantly. Oh, that girl, Inez said with a quiet smile. Your mother raised you right, if you remember her. She helped everyone here, Inez continued. Fixed clothes, watched kids, brought soup when people got sick. Never had much money herself, but somehow she made the building feel like family. Callan asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. What happened to her? Inez's smile faded gently. She got sick, she said, real fast. Cancer. The old woman looked down the hallway where Winnie's apartment sat, but she left that little girl something stronger than money. Callan knew exactly what she meant. He had already seen it. $2 in a small hand, and a promise that honesty mattered more than survival. The legal battle began quietly. Then it exploded. Within a week, Dorian Voss's legal team filed a formal motion seeking expedited clearance of Halcyon House for redevelopment. The filing described the building as structurally outdated housing incompatible with modern urban planning needs. But the real strategy lay hidden between the lines. Soren Pike noticed it immediately. They're not just attacking the building, he told Callan. They're attacking the residents. Callan looked up sharply. Explain. They're arguing that some tenants, especially the children, have no legally recognized guardian. Callan's expression hardened, meaning they're trying to invalidate the tenancy itself. The courtroom hearing was scheduled only days later. When the morning finally arrived, Halcyon House residents filled several rows of benches in the small municipal courtroom. Some had never been inside a courthouse before. Winnie sat beside Callan quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. Micah sat with Inez in the hallway. Across the room, Dorian Voss looked calm and composed, as though the outcome had already been decided. When the proceedings began, his attorney spoke first. The property known as Halcyon House, the lawyer said smoothly, is currently occupied by residents whose legal standing is unclear, particularly minor occupants lacking official guardianship documentation. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The lawyer continued. Without proper legal guardians, tenancy protections cannot reasonably apply to these individuals. Callan felt Winnie's small hand tighten slightly beside him. The words were carefully chosen, cold, technical. But their meaning was devastating. If the court accepted that argument, Winnie and Micah could be removed from the building without violating the covenant. Because legally speaking, they wouldn't exist as protected tenants. Callan looked down at Winnie. She wasn't crying. She was listening, trying to understand why adults were discussing whether she belonged somewhere. And in that moment, something inside Callan settled into certainty. This fight wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about a child being erased by paperwork. And he was not going to allow that to happen. The courtroom had grown very quiet. The opposing attorney finished outlining the argument and sat down, confidently convinced the legal foundation beneath the children's tenancy had begun to crumble. Then Soren Pike stood. He adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly at his notes, and addressed the judge with measured calm. Your Honor. He began. The opposing counsel raises a point regarding guardianship. He paused. But that concern has already been addressed. A ripple of confusion moved across the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly. Explain. Soren turned toward Callan. Mr. Thorne. Callan stood slowly. Even Dorian Voss looked mildly curious. Callan's voice was steady, clear, and impossible to misinterpret. I have filed emergency guardianship paperwork with the court this morning, he said, for both Elowen Vale and Micah Vale. The entire courtroom reacted at once. Whispers, gasps, even the judge raised an eyebrow. You are requesting legal guardianship of these children, the judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. Callan didn't hesitate. They need someone legally responsible for their protection. I am prepared to take that responsibility. Across the room, Dorian Voss leaned back slightly, studying Callan, as though reassessing the entire battlefield. The judge reviewed the documents Soren handed to the clerk. Temporary guardianship is unusual under these circumstances, she said carefully. Callan nodded. I understand. But these children have lived in Halcyon House continuously. Their mother's residency ties them to the covenant protections attached to the building. He paused, then added quietly, they deserve someone to stand with them. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended in silence. The judge finally spoke. The court will review the guardianship filing. Pending review, Mr. Thorne is granted provisional standing to represent the minors in this housing dispute. Another wave of murmurs spread through the room. Dorian Voss's attorney looked suddenly less confident. Because the argument they had relied on, the idea that the children had no legal representation, had just collapsed. Winnie looked up at Callan, confusion and relief mixing in her expression. Does this mean we're not alone anymore? She whispered. Callan knelt beside her chair. "No," he said gently. "You're not." And for the first time since the eviction notice appeared, hope returned to Halcyon House. The morning of the full hearing arrived with a gray Boston sky pressing low over the courthouse. Snow from the previous night had turned into wet slush along the sidewalks, and reporters were already gathering outside the building by the time Callan Thorne stepped out of his car. Cameras flashed almost immediately. "Mr. Thorne, is it true you're seeking guardianship of the Vale children? Is this a personal case or a business conflict with Dorian Voss?" Callan ignored the questions. Inside the courthouse, the air carried the familiar scent of old wood paper and tension. Residents from Halcyon House filled nearly 2 rows of benches, bundled in coats and scarves, whispering nervously among themselves. Winnie sat quietly beside Callan. Her hair had been brushed neatly that morning, and she wore a borrowed navy coat from one of the tenants upstairs. Her small hands rested calmly in her lap, though her eyes moved around the room, carefully taking in everything. Across the courtroom, Dorian Voss sat with effortless confidence. His legal team was larger, louder, and clearly accustomed to winning. The judge entered. Court is now in session. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply across the room. Dorian's attorney stood first. "Your Honor," the lawyer began smoothly. "This case concerns a deteriorating residential structure standing in the direct path of critical urban redevelopment." He paced slowly in front of the bench. "The property owners intend to replace Halcyon House with modern housing that will provide greater economic value and improved safety for the city." Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then the lawyer continued. "While we sympathize with the tenants currently residing there, legal property rights must ultimately prevail over emotional attachment." He gestured toward the back rows. "Cities grow. Progress requires difficult transitions." Callan remained silent. Soren Pike rose next. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "this case is not about nostalgia or resistance to progress." He placed a document on the clerk's desk. "This case is about a legally binding covenant that was designed to prevent exactly this kind of displacement." Soren turned toward the courtroom gallery. The residents of Halcyon House were promised protection. He looked directly at the judge. And that promise is still enforceable today. The tension in the room shifted instantly. For the first time, the case was no longer about whether the building was old. It was about whether a promise written decades earlier still mattered. And everyone in the courtroom understood the stakes. The first witness called to the stand was Inez Bellamy. At 71, she walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and despite the nervous tremble in her hands, her eyes carried a quiet determination. Soren Pike approached the stand. "Ms. Bellamy," he began gently. "How long have you lived at Halcyon House?" 30 years, she answered. "And during that time, did you know a woman named Maris Vale?" The old woman smiled faintly. "Oh yes," she said softly. "Everyone did." Soren nodded. "Can you tell the court about her?" Inez took a moment before speaking again. "She was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed help before they asked," she said. "If a family was struggling, Maris would find a way to bring food. If a neighbor was sick, she'd sit with them so they weren't alone." Several residents nodded quietly from the gallery. "She helped organize childcare so parents could work." Inez continued. "She kept track of who needed help with rent or groceries." Her voice grew steadier. "That building stayed together because of her." Soren glanced briefly at Winnie. "And the children?" he asked. "Maris loved them more than anything," Inez said. She told everyone that her daughter Winnie had the strongest heart she'd ever seen. Across the courtroom, Dorian's attorney shifted uncomfortably. But Soren wasn't finished. "Ms. Bellamy," he said carefully. "What happened after Maris Vale passed away?" Inez looked down at her hands. "The children stayed," she said quietly. "And who took care of them?" The old woman's eyes lifted again. "Winnie did." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Soren paused. No further questions. The judge nodded slowly. The testimony had done something powerful. It reminded everyone in the room that Halcyon House wasn't just a structure on a property map. It was a place where lives had been built, protected, and held together. And now those lives were finally being heard. Dorian Voss's legal team did not wait long to strike back. The opposing attorney rose smoothly from his chair, buttoning his jacket, as he approached the center of the courtroom. "Miss Bellamy," he began politely, "your memories are admirable, but we must remember that this court is concerned with legal facts, not personal sentiment." He turned toward the judge. "The covenant being referenced by opposing counsel is more than 20 years old." He lifted a stack of documents. Since that time, the property has changed ownership multiple times, including several restructuring transfers. He paused. In many cases, such transfers render older covenants legally obsolete. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the courtroom. Then he delivered the real blow. Furthermore, he continued, the validity of the original covenant is unclear because the activation documents were never formally executed in the county registry. Soren Pike's expression tightened slightly. That line mattered. Without proof that the covenant had been officially enacted, its protections could collapse. The attorney stepped closer to the bench. Without that verification, he concluded Halcyon House cannot claim the protections being asserted today. Silence fell across the courtroom. Even the residents in the back row leaned forward anxiously. Callan felt the weight of the moment immediately. Everything depended on a single missing document. One piece of proof that the promise made decades ago had actually been activated. If it couldn't be found, the judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Pike," she said, "do you have documentation confirming the covenant's legal activation?" For the first time since the trial began, the room held its breath. Soren stood slowly. He glanced at the files on the table. Then he looked toward Callan. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "we are currently reviewing additional archival records." The judge nodded once. "I will allow time for further documentation to be presented." The gavel struck lightly. But the message was clear. The case now hinged on a single truth buried somewhere in the past. And if they could not find it, Halcyon House might still fall. The courtroom recessed for the afternoon, but the tension did not leave with the gavel. For Callan Thorne, the next 12 hours became a race against time. If the original covenant activation document truly existed, it had to be somewhere inside the city's archives foundation records or the legal storage from his father's old company. That night, Callan and Soren Pike sat inside a dimly lit municipal archive room, surrounded by stacks of aging files and microfilm records. Dust hung in the air under yellow fluorescent lights. Boxes were pulled from metal shelves. Old project folders were opened. Page after page of property documents passed across the table. At nearly midnight, Soren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. If the activation paperwork was never officially filed, he said the covenant may not hold. Callan remained silent. He was staring at a thin folder labeled Halcyon Community Housing Initiative 2003. He opened it slowly. Inside were handwritten notes, foundation memos, and a final development approval packet, signed by multiple officials. Then he saw it. A narrow attachment stapled to the back. The heading read, Covenant Implementation Annex. Soren leaned forward immediately. They read it together. The annex confirmed that the anti-displacement covenant had been formally activated as a condition of tax approval for the property redevelopment project, meaning the clause protecting Halcyon House residents had not been symbolic. It had been legally binding, and it remained binding on any future owners who benefited from the land agreement. Soren sat back slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "that changes everything." The next morning, the courtroom filled again. Soren stood and placed the newly discovered annex before the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly. "We have located the official covenant implementation record." The judge examined the document carefully. Across the room, Dorian Voss leaned forward for the first time. Because suddenly the case was no longer uncertain. The promise made 20 years ago had proof, and the law was about to decide whether that promise still mattered. The courtroom felt impossibly still. Even the quiet scratching of the court reporter's pen seemed loud against the silence. The judge studied the annex document for several minutes, flipping carefully through its pages. The language was clear. The covenant protecting Halcyon House residents had not only been drafted, it had been officially enacted. She finally looked up. The court recognizes that the Halcyon Community Housing Covenant was activated as part of the 2003 redevelopment agreement tied to this property. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. The judge continued. This covenant includes a binding clause preventing the forced displacement of resident families without provision of equivalent housing under community protection guidelines. She turned toward Dorian Voss's legal team. The redevelopment proposal submitted by Mr. Voss's entities does not meet those conditions. The words landed with quiet force. The eviction action is therefore denied. For a moment, no one moved. Then the meaning reached the room. Residents of Halcyon House began to whisper, then breathe again, some wiping tears from their eyes. Across the aisle, Dorian Voss remained composed, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed the loss. The judge struck the gavel once more. The residents of Halcyon House are protected under the existing covenant. This court orders an immediate suspension of the redevelopment eviction action. It was over. Callan turned slowly toward Winnie. She looked confused at first, searching his face for the answer. Then he nodded. "You get to stay," he said softly. The little girl blinked once. Then a small smile appeared, the first real one anyone in the courtroom had seen from her. And the entire room seemed warmer because of it. Spring arrived slowly in Boston that year. Snow melted from the sidewalks of Halcyon Row, and the weak winter sunlight gradually softened into warmer afternoons. But the biggest change stood right in the middle of the block. Halcyon House was still there. Months after the court ruling, Callan Thorne quietly purchased the controlling ownership of the property through a transparent agreement that honored the original covenant. Instead of demolishing the building, he funded a complete restoration. Broken pipes were replaced. Heating systems were modernized. The cracked lobby tiles were repaired. Apartments were renovated so families could live there safely, without losing the character that had made the place feel like home. But Callan did something else, too. On the wall near the entrance, a small bronze plaque was installed. It read, "Halcyon House Community Residence dedicated to Maris Vale, whose kindness built the heart of this home." The unveiling ceremony was small. Just the residents, a few neighbors, and the construction team who had worked through the winter. Winnie stood beside Callan during the moment the plaque was revealed. Micah held her hand. After the applause faded, Winnie reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small piece of wax paper. Inside was the same $2 bill she had chased Callan's car to return months earlier. The edges were carefully flattened, protected like something precious. She placed it gently in Callan's hand. "My mom said honest money matters," she said quietly. Callan looked down at the small bill. "And promises do too," Winnie added. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he closed his hand around the bill and smiled. Micah tugged on Winnie's sleeve. "Are we staying here forever?" the little boy asked. Winnie looked around the bright hallway of the restored building. Residents laughed in the lobby. Sunlight filled the windows. And for the first time since her mother had passed away, the word home no longer felt fragile. "Yes," she said softly. "This time, it's staying." Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.